As we consider the many different ways that God moves in and through us, I want to zero in on a portion of Jacob's life for just about 10 minutes, if you will. It's an interesting passage. We'll read portions of it in just a second, but I want to start by talking about naming people. We call out names to remember. Imagine, if you will, what it would be like if you were a child who had somehow, in some circumstance, had been separated from your family. And maybe it's at Disney World. Maybe it's at a place, a shopping center, or a shopping mall. And that child, if you would imagine for just a moment being that child, if you had that moment when you realized, when you turned around, and you were alone, what would go through your mind? Fear, right? Many people could come up to you, and even though you are in a crowd of other people, you would feel alone because you were separated from your family. There is something about that moment, I would imagine, that would ring true in a lot of us and a lot of kids, that there would be a sense of panic. And there is probably only one thing that would happen that would calm that child's heart: hearing their name called. Not just hearing their name called by a stranger, but hearing their name called by a loved one. You know, parents have taken the liberty of using some very strategic English and phonics when it comes to naming children. My brother is a construction worker, and I didn't know what this word meant, but he told me there was a boy who was named Tyvek, Tyvek. Ken, you probably know what that is. It is the insulation that goes inside of a house to prevent the elements from outside. And when when the mother was asked, why did you name that child Tyvek? She said, well, while we were driving to the hospital, all we saw were unfinished buildings with the word Tyvek on it. And I thought, man, that was on my mind at that time. Parents take some liberty. Now, I don't know about you, but Lisa and I did not just haphazardly pick names. They were names that we had thought about, and usually names that were had some connection to us, that would have some importance. My grandfather's name was Arthur John Fugh. Norma, his wife, when they had their first son, did not want to name that child, my dad, Arthur, because she said if I was afraid that when I would call out for Arthur, I would not only just have one person ignore me, I'd have two people ignore me. So my dad was named John Arthur Fugh. I'm the one of four boys. Yes, my parents were blessed with four boys. And I was given that name, John Arthur Fugh. I'm a junior. And when our son came and was born, we named him John Arthur Fugh III. There's a strategic intention that we use. And what's amazing is, although my dad has been with Jesus for 8 years now, there are some peculiarities that John does that just remind us of my dad. He's living into that name that we had chosen for him. In 1861, in the Daily Dispatch, there was it was a newspaper in Richmond. There was an announcement. Apparently in the 19th century, if you wanted to change your name, there had to be a public announcement. And this is what it said. It said, an excellent citizen of Memphis, Mr. G.N. Lincoln, has petitioned the legislature to have his name changed. The petitioner alleges that his father and his grandfather were first-rate people, but he now deems their legacy unachievable for himself. Who told this man that he was not living into the name that he was given? I know that there are folks who point their fingers at other folks. But I bet the majority of that battle was within his own heart. And when he started to juxtapose the life of his father and his grandfather to his life, undoubtedly he came to the conclusion that he would never measure up as he saw more contrasts and more conflicts than he saw comparisons. Who told this man? Undoubtedly, the voice that was the loudest was his own. Names are so important. In the scriptures, names are used to project upon that person the intentions of the parents. There are examples too numerous to zero into of when God divinely changes somebody's name. And when he does it, in all of the cases, when he does it, when God changes somebody's name, what he desires to do is recharacterize that particular person. In other words, what God intends to do when he changes somebody's name is he wants God's dreams and aspirations to be the aspirations and the dreams of that person. Where that person who had his name or her name changed no longer rests on the foundation of what others had projected upon them, and even himself or herself. But there is a stark difference of relinquishing, of letting go, and allowing yourself to get to a point where you, at least in the scriptures, these men and women were able to live into what God had intended for them. And here we come to Jacob. Jacob was born to Rebekah and Isaac. And Jacob, as the scriptures unfold and tell us this story, at his birth, his twin brother was older by a few milliseconds. The scriptures say that Jacob had his hand on the heel of Esau. And I would imagine there was a struggle that he was trying to pull him back in to get out first. Because in this period, there was a lot of benefit to be the firstborn man. And so the mother and the father gave the child the name Jacob. Do you know what that word means? Deceiver. Cheat. How would you like to be called cheater? Deceiver. And hearing over and over and over again those projections of what other people see within you. Jacob had a lifelong history of deception. He deceived his brother for the birthright. He deceived his father for the blessing. He even was deceived by his uncle Laban when he worked for 7 years to get the hand of Rebekah to marry. He woke up after a drunken stupor and found out Leah was his wife and had to work another 7 years to get Rebekah. And as he is leaving Laban, he left on bad terms. And as he's leaving, he's in a place where it's a lonely place, and he gets word that his brother Esau is coming, and there's probably not much good that he could think was going to happen if his brother Esau is coming after him with 400 soldiers. So he's in a spot. He's between a rock and a hard place. He can't go back to Laban. He can't go home. And so what he does is he starts sending gifts, people, to Esau to smoothen him up, to soften him up, and to the point where it's only him and his wives and his children, and he separates himself across the river Jabbok, and he is alone in this place. And the scriptures say he wrestled with a man all night. Later, Jacob says, I have wrestled with God. So this one who comes to wrestle him is the one who promised the blessings upon him. God. Now I gotta stop here for just a second, because the scriptures tell us in this passage that no one prevailed. No one. Now if I'm fighting God, who do you think is going to win? Might be close, I don't know, but if you might be able to say if it's me and somebody else, if I'm going to fight, all right, come on, put up your dukes, let's do it. Let's go to the mat. But if I'm going to fight God, there is no way that I would imagine that I would win, or at least it would end on a draw. And so as they're struggling that night, God, and as day is breaking, the morning is breaking, the God asks Jacob, let me go, release me. And Jacob says, not until you bless me. And then he said, okay, I'll bless you. What do you imagine happened? Of course you know what happened. But I would imagine what should have happened is maybe God put his hand on his shoulder and, I bless you. Not God bless you, I bless you. It's not. He said, what is your name? What is your name? Now we can't really dive into the logistics of what was happening, but I bet you there was a moment where Jacob stopped. And the first thought he thought undoubtedly was, why is that important? I don't want to tell you my name, because my name I have lived into my name. I have cheated people. I have deceived people. I have been deceived. I have been cheated. My life is a wreck. Why do you need to know my name? What is your name? My name is deceiver, cheater. And listen to the blessing. You're no longer a deceiver. You're no longer a cheat. You are now Israel. You're now Israel. You know what's amazing about that? Is in that moment, God re-characterized who he had been and what other people had thought about him for years, and said, you are no longer that person. I want you to see yourself through my eyes, God says. I want you to see the importance that I see in you. I want you to see yourself as one who has been characterized with the divine aspirations that I have for you. Oh, what a blessing. Can you imagine? This was not a struggle against the physical. This wasn't about who was going to win. I don't think this was Jacob versus God in a wrestling match. Do you know what I think this was? This was Jacob and God fighting together for one thing. Jacob's heart. I really believe that. This is not a physical wrestling match. This is a spiritual match over the heart of Jacob. You know what Dallas Willard says? God has given himself permission not to rule over one thing in the world, and that is the human heart. And you and I and Jacob are the only ones who can live into what God has for us. The human heart is a part of us that holds us, that defines us, and we listen to that more than we listen to the way that God sees us and characterizes us. And we think we have to make everything happen. We have to make it that everything rises and falls upon our shoulders. My friends, that is not the case. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against the principalities, as Ephesians 6 says, against the forces of this dark world out there. And one of the ways that Satan gets into our lives is through our desires and our hearts and our aspirations. And Jacob had to surrender. And it wasn't God fighting against him, it was God fighting with him. And as they left, God touched his hip socket. And from that day forward, Jacob walked with a limp. I wonder what story he told when years later people asked, Jacob, is that a motorcycle accident? Is that a football injury? What happened to your hip? What do you think he said? Almost certainly, his mind would flash back to that night and find himself resonating with joy and relief that his battle was not alone, and that God loved him so much to recharacterize, to redefine who he is by asking him that one question, what is your name? And he would share that the limp is a reminder from that day forward that God had changed the trajectory of his life. Friends, as I close, listen. 1 Peter says this in chapter 3. He says this, always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks for the reason for the hope that you have. And when somebody asked Jacob, why do you have hope? Jacob said this, my hope is in the Lord. And for us Easter people, our hope is in the Christ who had risen from the dead. Our hope is that there are better days to come. Our hope is that the future of the rest of this day and the weeks to come, and that Thursday at 7 a.m., whatever's on your calendar, it is okay. Because our anchor is held behind the veil. And we are tethered to just that. Peter, he flashed back, if you will, to what God did in his life. And God changed his name. And this passage I read is in the 3rd chapter. But in the 1st chapter, he says this, blessed be the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, who, through his wonderful and great mercies, has caused us to be born again into a living hope through the death and the resurrection of Christ. Oh, may that be the case for you. Just one question remains. What is your name?